Hey, this is Lindsay. I'm down here at Chaparral Motorsports with Vinyl MX today, and we're going to talk about a little bit of a key setup I don't think most people consider when they're putting either their forks or their front wheel back on the bike. But if you don't set it up properly, you can bind up the lower legs, which can cause some friction and harshness in your forks. So today, we're going to show you how you can avoid that. The tools you'll need for this project are fairly simple. Either a 10mm T-handle or socket will get you with the triple clamps and with the fork lugs. Having a torque wrench also in this case would be preferred. And then other than that, you really only need the tools required for your bike to take the front axle off, which in most cases is going to be a 21 or 22mm nut that's on the axle for most full-size bikes. KTMs are a little different, some of your mini bikes, etc. So just check it out, but really that should be all you need. Actually, in a prior video, we have covered basically how you install the actual fork tubes themselves, and we talk a little bit about torquing the triple clamps to the proper spec and why it's important, but I'm going to double cover that right now because it plays a lot into how we're talking about friction and points that the fork can bind up. But easiest way to think about this is the lower tube passes through the upper tube, and at a certain point that lower tube is going to pass behind or underneath where the triple clamps are clamping onto your upper tube. If this area is crimped down too tightly, it'll put extra pressure or actually start to crush down the upper tube, which will make it a lower tolerance when the lower tube goes to pass through it, which will cause it to bind on the bushings and create friction. It's actually pretty funny as a lot of people say, oh, I feel mid-stroke harshness in my fork. And from time to time, I've found people that have over-tightened this area by double to triple, usually double what the torque spec is, and that can cause a lot of those issues. So if you want to learn more about putting on the forks, check out that video. But basically, you want to try to always stick to the OEM recommendation here. A really good general rule of thumb for full-size bikes is you can usually get away with 14 foot-pounds down below, 16 to 18 up top, but check your manual, they're usually within a pound or two of that range. But if you end up 20 or above on the lower surface, you're gonna start to create some issues. Kind of wrap your head around what we're talking about here. You think of both fork legs, and when the fork is compressing, both of them moving up. There is a lot of forces applied to the fork though. If you actually got to see a slow-mo, it's pretty cool how much these lower legs flex forward to aft from the upper tube while they're moving in, which creates friction at different points. Now what can happen though during assembly, and it's something that we can completely circumvent, is the side load that can be caused on these forks. So we're using the axle off here as an example, but say we have the perfect, or at least what most bikes will look like they settle in, where you have the axle looks pretty flush to the fork leg. Sometimes you'll have it as you slide this axle into the wheel, it'll catch on the fork leg, which can happen if the forks aren't exactly the same height, little things like that. There's reasons it can catch. This lower lug over here can catch and get pulled over. As you can see, even with my hand, I can do it quite a bit, and you can end up with it being cranked over just 2-3 millimeters, but as it goes through the stroke, you now have your lower tube at an angle and binding the entire time is trying to pass into the upper tube. So our goal, what we're going to show in assembly, is to try to make sure that you don't end up with a lug that's binding in, or a little more rare case, but binding outwards. So as you can see, we've just slid the axle in. We aren't all the way flush. The axle isn't actually fully engaged yet. Now this is where some people make a mistake. They just kind of slide it in to a certain point where they feel like it stops. They start tightening the fork lugs, they start tightening the axle, and this is where we can start to get into a bind. So this is the way at least I prefer to go about this. So as we can see, we need our axle to finish engaging onto the inside of the wheel spacer here. So take our nut, go ahead and place it on. And then we're gonna start tightening down the front axle so it starts pulling it. So as you can see, just even from tightening it down a little bit, we've gone flush. So I usually will sit here and continue to tighten it until either the axle spins, which this one doesn't seem like it's going to, or we feel like we've snugged up quite a bit. So now at this point, what my worry would be, or what I'm gonna double check, is I have tightened down the axle as much as I'd like. The axle has now been pulled over, but I want to make sure that this lug hasn't binded onto the axle and been pulled over with it. Visually, I believe we are good, but we're going to show you how to do it anyways. So at this point, the only thing that's been tightened down is the nut to the axle. Our fork lugs on both sides are still loose. So basically what we're trying to accomplish by pulling down on the front end is we're trying to contract the lower tube into the upper tube. So if there's a bind when you have the axle lugs loose, if the axle is binded over, and as the lower tube goes into the upper tube, it'll naturally pull itself back straight and kind of settle the axle lug in a natural point. If it is really binded up, typically if you're doing that pulling motion, you can look down, you'll see the axle pop over into more of a centered or its more natural position. Once we've done that, we can actually now tighten down the axle lugs because everything is centered where we need it to be. Now that our fork lugs are tightened down, we can give the axle itself one last snugging up, because now with the axle brackets, fork lugs, whatever you want to call them, are actually tightened down, the axle will not move in either direction. It is now secure. So the last thing is just tightening down that axle nut to retain it in, because realistically the tension from the fork lugs is more or less what holds the axle while trying. This is just more of a security purpose to make sure if anything loosens up here that the axle cannot slide out during operation. Now that we have everything secure, the bike is ready to ride again. Like I said, I really preach little setup tips like this because a lot of riders spend good money having their suspension revalved, resprung to the right weight. And once you've spent that money, you might as well do everything you can to make sure the fork and shock are still working in their proper condition or to the best of their abilities at all times. If you want to check out more tech tips, stay tuned to VitalMX.com and make sure you also go over to shopmoto.com to support them as well.